Welcome to the Academy of Photography. Look into my eyes, look into my eyes. Don't look around, don't look around. You're under. From today, you're going to use only RAW files. When you're going to take your camera and you're going to shoot, don't use JPEG, just use RAW. I repeat, from today, you're going to use only RAW file. 3, 2, 1, you're back in a room. I'm Christian Tudor, and today I'm gonna join the debate RAW versus JPEGs. Why do I want to do that? For me, as a seasoned photographer, seems things are very simple. I shoot only RAW, and I'm gonna tell you about the advantages in a second. I have realized that after a few videos, there are still a lot of confused people out there, and there's a lot of struggle with the concept why RAW and why JPEG. I'm gonna give you a very simple explanation why RAW is the best way to go and why JPEG has some limitations, and you can decide for yourself what you want to do. In order to continue, I would suggest you go back and review one of my previous videos, how the camera works, so you can understand how a sensor works and how light is recorded onto the sensor. For every pixel that you see on your screen, for every dot in your image, there is a corresponding cluster on the camera sensor. So if you have a high resolution sensor, that means there are millions of little clusters that trap inside light, and they will give you the amount of exposure. The light gets into the sensor, gets recorded in terms of intensity and color, and for each little point on your sensor, you will have a corresponding point in your image. As simple as that. I'm gonna go back and use the analogy of a sensor cluster getting filled with water. So during one exposure, I have the cluster. Let's consider only one unit. If the glass is empty, I'm talking about dark image. There's no light inside, so you're going to have something underexposed. During an exposure, this cluster is exposed to light, obviously, until you actually finish the exposure and the amount of light in the cluster reaches a certain level. The glass is empty, that means under exposure, you don't have a lot of photons inside, you don't have a lot of light. And if the glass gets filled completely with water, it's going to spill over. That means overexposure. It is very important to understand this concept. What I wanted to say, what is RAW? RAW is basically all the data. It's getting recorded into the sensor on each pixel, on each cluster. And it's not necessarily only the amount of light recorded, it's also the process. So a RAW file, it's unprocessed data coming from your camera through your camera processor. It's not a traditional image format file. It's basically a lot of information containing for each pixel the amount of color of light and also the history. That is very important. The camera will remember the history. Why is it important? Because the camera is smarter these days, and you can modify that file and you can simulate what would have happened if you'd taken a different exposure. That will give you the flexibility to go back and fix an image if it's overexposed to properly exposed, or fix an image the other way. If it's underexposed, the camera has enough information to predict what would have happened if you would have allowed for a longer exposure. So what we're saying here is using the RAW file will give you the freedom to fix an image in post-production later if the level of exposure is not right. You have all the information and you can relate to it later if there's a problem. This is the biggest advantage, and I would not even consider not using it. The only downside of using RAW is the large size of files, because the camera processor is going to record a lot of information. And remember, history or depth, let's consider it depth, it's also recorded. The second option for the cluster is basically turn the image from the camera directly into a JPEG file. What is a JPEG? JPEG is a traditional image format that remembers only one level from this glass. The camera doesn't know what's below or what's above that level. That means if I'm trying to modify this image in post-production, I'm not gonna get an accurate result. The advantages of the JPEGs are the size, because the camera does not remember the history. So JPEG files are usually half or even a third, depending on the quality. You can actually control that quality and you can get low size files. The disadvantages of the JPEG, for me, it's very obvious. You lose all that information and the camera is not able to predict anymore what would have happened in a different case for a different exposure. So remember, RAW means an image, but you also have the depth, so you can access whatever it's hidden. With the JPEG file, whatever you get from the camera, that's about it. Within reason, you can actually increase the exposure or not, but once the information is lost, you'll not be able to recover it. Let's give you an example. If I would overexpose a portrait, and let's say the face is white, so it's overexposed, using a RAW file might help me to actually access the lost information like wrinkles or all sorts of details which seem to be lost. However, they are still there. Using a JPEG file, you're not going to be able to do that. I hope that's very clear. RAW advantages, you have the information recorded. Larger files, more memory. JPEGs, smaller files, but you lose information. Now, it depends on your needs and on your skills. You can shoot RAW and JPEG. What I do is use the RAW files as the basis. I can always go back to my files if something is wrong. As a professional wedding photographer, I use only RAW files. And why? Because I always have that information and I always can relate to it. I don't take 100% of all exposures correct. Sometimes I get underexposed and overexposed images, but I always have the chance to go back. I have explained in many videos my workflow, which seems to be a little bit confusing. So what I do, I take the RAW file and I always keep a backup of the RAW file. I always can reference to it. I turn them into JPEGs and I work on JPEG. Now I use Lightroom because I need to process a large amount of images. The size of the images makes a very big difference in my workflow. If I need to bring 1000 JPEG images and each JPEG is 10 megabytes, it does have a big difference if I would bring RAW images into my software and they will be 21, 25 megabytes. So basically I'm working with much less data and that increases the time for response from my computer. If my computer would be perfect and I would not see the difference, definitely I will use RAW files directly into Lightroom. But in my case, one JPEG brought onto my screen becomes ready for editing in 1 or 2 seconds. One RAW file becomes ready for editing in 20 seconds. Multiply that for 1000 and imagine how much time I need to spend processing thousands of pictures. I presented you the difference between RAW and JPEG. The decision rests with you. My decision is purely based on business efficiency because I need to decrease the number of hours I spend on post-production. I hope my explanation was easy to understand. If you're still confused or still have any questions, feel free to leave some comments or just go onto the website and leave your comments there. I'll be happy to respond. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching. Feel free to subscribe on the Academy of Photography website and you'll receive our weekly newsletter. Thanks for all of you who responded to my question the other day if the newsletter should be weekly or fortnightly. At this stage, probably it's going to be weekly because I have a lot of responses on that regard. I know there are a lot of you who prefer to have a fortnightly letter, so if this becomes too much for you, please ignore once in a while, but because the vast majority requested a weekly newsletter, I'm going to try to adapt. Also, don't forget, we are receiving Academy of Photography membership applications. Just write a few articles about your photography and we'll be happy to publish them. Also, if you're interested, submit your pictures and you're going to get ratings on the website. And until I see you next time, I wish you happy shooting. Thank you very much.